Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to the second season of the YIF podcast. My name is Shiv Sharma. I'm a YIF alum from the class of 2015. The hosting this evening session for you. The theme of the second season of the YIF podcast is "The Professor Will See You Now." It's really just a good way for us to sort of bring professors who teach at the YF here, talk about their intellectual journeys, personal journeys, but also what their interests are and what they teach at the YF. I'm very, very delighted to have Madhavi Menon in conversation with me today. Thank you so much, Madhavi, for joining us. Just to quickly introduce, Madhavi Menon is a professor of English at the Ashoka University and also the director of the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka. Among her various interests include queer theory, Renaissance literature, and Shakespeare. And again, among her numerous books include Indifference to Difference on Queer Universalism and her latest, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India. And her current book project is titled The Law of Desire. Thank you so much for joining. I'm so glad to be in conversation with you, given that I've actually worked with you for the last 5 years.
Thanks, Shiv. It's lovely to be here. Although I must say, I don't know who would sign on to listen to me. They must be already sick and tired of me and fed up of having heard me in class. But if you're here, then you're more masochistic than I guessed after seeing you in class. So good for you.
I think I'm sure everybody, because at least in my class, students keep talking about you and Professor Harris. So they're all excited to hear about your lives.
And and your class, Shiv, you remember, was not the most, shall we
I
say,
know.
was not the most successful
Yep,
successful class at the YF. You poor things.
that's true. But we'll come to it later, I think, at the
Okay,
YF
okay.
class.
I won't spill all your secrets right now.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
yes, just to tell everyone, this conversation is really about Shiv and his secrets, not about me at all.
not um, just to begin the conversation, I actually sort of wanted to just ask you how and when did you find your interest in literature and also the interest in questions of gender and sexuality? And, how do they come together in your life, in your classes, and the work that you do?
Yeah. My heart sank when Karan and Mohit said this is going to be about your journey intellectually, personally, because Shiv, you know me well enough to know that those are the kinds of questions I'm horrified by and I run screaming to the hills. I guess it's a testimony of my dedication to the YF that I actually agreed to come on anyway. I have no answer to the question of when I first started getting interested in literature. My mother was a professor of English, so maybe some part of that was just sort of, I imbibed it and absorbed it from what was around me. So there was always, and she did her PhD when my sister and I were, quite young. And so already when I was, say, 8 or 9 years old, I had a sense of what it meant to do a PhD in English, what it meant to
Right.
teach, what it meant to be surrounded by books and to be reading all the time. For my mother, of course, is an only child, and so she grew up just surrounded by books. That was her, all her siblings. And so I think it was just something that I always thought I would do and would study. There was a point in my life where I wanted to be the prime minister. If only I had stuck with that, then we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now.
That's
Um,
true.
there was another point at which I wanted to be a lawyer. That may still happen because I'm so fascinated by the law. But I think fairly early on, I was quite convinced that English is what I wanted to study. I was even quite clear that Shakespeare is what I wanted to study. And again, I have no memory of how or when that happened, but just that I was quite sure I wanted to do that. We had no word for queerness or queer theory or even sexuality. I mean, there was not a word that existed, not only because of the sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink factor,
Right.
but also because it was, never taught and never sort of discussed necessarily. My mother's work had nothing to do with this. So, I mean, that was not something that I grew up with. It was not something that came automatically to me in the air that I breathed. But I do remember, and I don't actually keep artifacts or souvenirs or anything, but my parents found this a few years ago. I was at age 10, I think. I was editor of the Colony newsletter. I don't even know if it was the Colony newsletter or just our road, you know. I think
Right.
that was the ambit of our ambitions.
So the activist on you was already coming out by the age of 10.
I guess so. So I was editor of this Colony newsletter, and my first editorial, the headline was "Boys: Something needs to be done." So I don't. So I think from an early age, I certainly recognized that gender played a big part in the world around me. And again, not necessarily personally, because I think my parents were quite wonderful on that front. And I had a sister, so it was not like, you know, there was a boy to be favored or anything of the kind. But clearly, I was attuned to what was going on around me in the world. And so early on, I had a sort of critique of gender. And I think that automatically on its own rolled over into questions of sexuality when I
Right.
was later on in school and college.
I mean, there's so many things I want to ask on already what you said.
Yeah.
But I mean, you said, I mean, I know that you already said that you don't know how and when you started getting into Shakespeare.
Yeah.
But maybe you want to talk about, I mean, you teach a course at the YF, which is called the Shakespeare and the World.
Yeah.
Why interest in Shakespeare, but also why that course, given the kind of audience YF is? What motivates you to teach Shakespeare?
Yeah. I mean, I think precisely because of the audience that YF is. I mean, I must say, just to backtrack a little bit and go on a tangent, the reason I joined Ashoka was because of the YF. I mean, it was, you know, both Gil and I were here on sabbatical for a year in 2011. And you know how Delhi can be a village of 200 people. So somebody told somebody that we were looking to move back to India. And the last somebody, I think, turned out to be Pramath. And so Pramath called us up and said, you know, we're starting this university. It's not built yet or anything, but we have this program called the Young India Fellowship. So why don't you come and give a talk to the Young India Fellows? And this was the first batch.
Right.
And so Gil went and gave a talk and said, oh my God, I'm completely blown away by these fellows and by this entire setup. And so I was a bit skeptical. I said, you know, whatever, we'll see. And then I went and did a talk, and I don't even remember what it was, but it was enthralling. The entire scenario and situation was enthralling. The number of questions, the amount of interest. And I think that was when, to borrow the title of the Peter Sellers movie, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, I think that's that's the time I learned to stop being too suspicious of engineers, because it's like, my God, these people are really good students.
Yeah.
And I think the discipline that engineers bring with them as students really stands the fellows in good stead. And obviously, they have come to the fellowship because they want to study different things and hear different things. So I think on both fronts, the very demographic consistency of the YF is what attracted me to it. And so then, you know, then of course, you know, what to teach. And I remember we used to have long chats with Anunay about it. And the idea was, you know, most fellows would probably not have had much exposure to Shakespeare at all. And this is something that they should have. But, you know, the entire sort of thinking around Ashoka University, and Gil and I were the sort of first faculty to be hired. And so we were very involved with those conversations. And the entire thinking around Ashoka University was that we have to make sure that we do not forget our location. And so because we are located in India, even though we're trying to do a university and a pedagogy more along the lines of a liberal arts university in the United States, we cannot forget our location in India. And so we wanted to talk about Shakespeare, the sort of bastion, the vanguard of Western literature,
Right.
but wanted to do it in a way that actually acknowledged his relation to the rest of the world. And so that's how the title Shakespeare and the World came about. And of course, you know, as you know, our structure is always the same, even though the contents can change. Each of us does one play and adaptations of that play from around the world, feeding into the fellows' final project, which is their own adaptations, many of which are just fantastic. And this year, by the way, just a shout out to the current YF, we did the entire thing on Zoom, and their presentations were marvelous. So it just goes to show that that's an idea that endures, and I'm really grateful for that.
No, I think even I remember. I think at the one of the courses that I still have vivid memories of from the YF is Shakespeare and the World, and how the entire perspective of looking at Bollywood changed because we were
Yeah.
watching critically thinking about films like Omkara
Yeah.
and sort of other films, which was great. I mean, something that you've already sort of mentioned here, and I want to pick up on it because I think it really is pertinent to the YF, right? Because I think your work herself, as I know it, has moved into multiple disciplines, crossing one disciplinary boundaries. Now you're working on law. Your last book was really about history in many ways. So I'm just sort of, I wanted to ask you, could you tell us a little bit about these movements across the field and sort of how do you find these connections, and maybe with that, about your current interests too?
Yeah. Shiv, again, this is a question I think I'll be bad at because for me, it really doesn't feel like movements across. I mean, for me, and I say this all the time to my students, you've heard me say this so many times. For me, what you have to be interested in is an idea
Right.
and a set of ideas, a set of questions. And then you chase that idea wherever it takes you. You chase those questions wherever it takes you. And then that chase, that pursuit might take you across what get recognized as disciplinary boundaries, but actually are not what necessarily make themselves aware to you in that form.
Right.
So it was not so when I was, to go back to Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, which was my most recent book, when my editor asked me to write something like that, and he got in touch with me after reading some of my op-eds and newspaper pieces and said, I really want you to do this. I was quite flummoxed because I am not a scholar of India. I'm not a scholar of Indian history or philosophy or religion or anything of the kind, or even literature. And so I had no idea how to write that book. And the only way I could write it was really thinking as a queer theorist, which is what I'm trained to do. And so my thinking around that book was, how do I take the major ideas that animate debates in queer theory today and think about finding pegs in the vast landscapes of the Indic civilizations on which to hang them? So the focus was always the idea. The focus was always the question. And so even though I had, 20 different really short chapters, each chapter had an argument that was an argument from queer theory.
Right.
And so similarly, the book that I'm working on now, and I sort of just finished the manuscript for it, called The Law of Desire. I'm not trained in the law. I'm not, but I sort of joke saying I seem to specialize in writing about things I'm not trained in or trained to do, or that I should
Which is
not,
the fun of it, right?
which is part of the fun. Even when I went to the US to do my PhD, there was not a lot, but there was some surprise that I would want to work on Shakespeare. Because, of course, the idea is if Indians go and do a PhD, then they should work on Indian stuff. And that had frankly never even occurred to me. So I think I've specialized in always working on things that are not expected of me to work on. So the law of desire, for instance, it's not written from the perspective of a lawyer. It's again written from the perspective of a queer theorist, right? What is it about laws and judgments that have a bearing on how we think about desire, how we think about sexuality, how we think about gender, how these feed into multiple other fields? And so, again, for me, what straddles these fields is the question.
Yeah.
The fields themselves, to me, don't feel disparate or discrete.
I mean, that's great, Madhavi, because I know that when I was reading Infinite Variety, this is really the sort of brilliance about the book, that you actually don't even use the word queer theory so much in the book. But when one is reading and if one is familiar with queer theory, they can start making those connections. And I think this is what my experience of Shakespeare in the World was too, where you really didn't see Shakespeare as a Western sort of literary figure anymore when we were in that course.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, but because we're talking about these connections, I'm just curious if, while writing Infinite Variety, but also your current book, do you think that the current political context, cultural context, struggles in India that we've witnessed, during the last few years, they've animated your work in any sense or sort of inspired your thinking?
Yeah. I sometimes joke, though it's not funny, that I timed my return to India really badly, because I got back only a few months before the 2014 election. And for me, yes, the last few years has been difficult politically. When I'm feeling optimistic, I can think of it as being enabling. But that's maybe 0.00001% of the time. 99.99% of the time, I'm not feeling optimistic. It's been interesting because at the beginning, I thought it was quite actually enabling to write about, just to sort of take a fairly random example, the sort of making the national anthem mandatory in cinema theaters, for instance, or the sort of overturning of the 2009 Delhi High Court judgment by the Supreme Court on Section 377. It was interesting to write about all that because one still felt one had an audience and a group to work with. And that's one of the things, by the way, just as a bit of an aside, that I still love about being in India and being in Delhi is that, the Indian intellectual ecosystem is so rich that academics tend to read the same thing as activists, tend to read the same things as lawyers, tend to read the same things as, as lay people a lot of the time, which, as you know, is not the case, say, in the US, where everything is so highly specialized that you don't really cross those boundaries at all. And so it just felt like a rich conversation that was happening. I think that conversation has whittled down somewhat over the last few years, which is disappointing, but I am part of that whittling down. I think I'm writing less now for newspapers and for online venues, which is too bad. But maybe once this book is out, I'll resume doing that as well. But one has to be able to speak in whatever voice one has, especially if one is feeling voiceless.
No, I think that I mean, I think all of us would relate to it and all of us would want to hang on to it when we're doing our intellectual work right now. But I mean, speaking of ideas, I'm also just curious because you also mentioned that you were surrounded by books when you were growing up. And I know that you also teach a course called The Great Books at Ashoka for the undergraduates. But if for our audience, you would like to mention a few books, authors, ideas that have stayed with you throughout your journey as an intellectual, as a professor, we'd love to hear about that.
From the Great Book syllabus, or
No, just
yeah.
generally, yeah.
Okay. Again, this is Shiv, you're asking me all the questions that I'm terrible at responding to. If someone says, "Well, who's your favorite author?" It's like blank. This is a complete, blank page. I have no clue or idea. I mean, clearly, Shakespeare figures way up there for me. Any kind of sort of theoretical text figures way up there for me. I'm sort of weird that way. If I need to calm down and feel good about things, I like to read theory, and all kinds of theory. But the dirty secret of professors is that we simply do not read as much as we used to when we were grad students. And let this be a lesson to all of you still in graduate school or aspiring to be in graduate school. This is your time to read, because once you start working, it becomes very, very hard. In fact, there's this joke about this famous professor in the UK called Jacqueline Rose. She's a queer theorist, a psychoanalytical theorist. And apparently she was asked one day whether she had read a particular book. And she said, "Read it? I haven't even taught it." So this idea that you actually only end up reading the books that you're teaching. Otherwise, the space and time for reading is simply not there. But I will say, this semester has been crazy, crazy, crazy for a million reasons. And, I won't go into all of them. But just in relation to reading, I was teaching an overload. It was madness on Zoom. And so there were 3 classes that I was responsible for. Plus, I was on the jury for the Tata Lit Fest Fiction Prize. And so I had to read about 55 novels in the course of about 2.5 months. So wow. As I said, it was a crazy semester. Right. So I read 55 novels this semester. So I can tell you that. And I would highly recommend, for instance, the one that won the award, which is Annie Zedi's book, Prelude to a Riot. And it's a very, very brief book. And one of the interesting things about being on this jury for the fiction prize is that at least I think a good 75% of the books, to go back to the earlier question that we were just talking about, a good 3/4 of the books were actually about the state of India today and about the state of sort of simmering tension. And Annie Zedi's book was particularly good because nothing happens in the book, but it's just the sense of capturing that simmering, boiling volcano, the lava that's, about to erupt, that erupts in little spurts and that's about to erupt. And so that was wonderful. The other thing that I love reading is, and that too I've been reading a little bit of this semester, is actually, thrillers. Thrillers are my poison.
That I actually didn't know at all.
Oh, really? Oh my God. I am very, very into Scandi noir. I'm very into all kinds of thrillers. But my latest love is Japanese thrillers. I just absolutely love them. And so I just finished something called The Honjin Murders by Seishi Yokomizo. And, that was great. But one Japanese novel that I will recommend, it's not a thriller at all. It's actually, it's by this guy called Junichiro Tanizaki, who's often been described as the Japanese Jane Austen. And I think that's not quite right, but it just gives you a sense. Right. And he has this amazing novel called The Makioka Sisters. And that I would just recommend highly, highly to anybody. So, you just got to read what gives you pleasure. And this semester, that's what has given me pleasure. And generally in life, there's too many things, too many books that have given me pleasure for me to list them.
Right. I mean, this somewhat also sort of responds to a lot of questions that are coming up about how do you choose a PhD topic? How did you choose your PhD topic? And I'm just tempted to say, read Japanese literature, read sort of all different literature from different parts of the world, and sort of keep yourself open to ideas. I mean, just want to change gears a little bit because I know we've been talking about your role as a professor at Ashoka. I'm also just interested in hearing about your role as a director of the CSGS, the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality. What got you interested in the project in the first place? And if at all, what have you found exciting about working at the CSGS?
Shiv, I am glaring at you right now. Just remember, this is me glaring at you because you know very, very well that if you had not been born on this earth, there would be no CSGS and I would certainly not be directing it. So I blame you and your fellow ELM teammates fully for this. And for those of you who don't know, the CSGS at Ashoka was born as an ELM project. This is why I've been suspicious of the ELM ever since then, because it gives rise to such consequences. And as you know, you guys came up with the blueprint for it. It's something that I have mixed feelings about, because on the one hand, I think it is very, very, very important to have a center like this. As you know, we are, the first, perhaps still the only center that actually uses the word sexuality in its title. Right. And, going back to what I was saying earlier, when I was growing up, that word simply didn't exist. So, didn't even hear of it. Whereas hopefully now, students going to school, students going to college will at least know there is a Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality. So even for that limited purpose, I think it's so important to have a center like this. And to that extent, I'm extremely proud and honored and delighted to be associated with it. I think the center has also done some exceptionally wonderful work. We've got wonderful speakers, had fabulous programming. Our most recent Summer of Ishq series was amazing, I thought. And so we really are generating a lot of material for a lot of people to access, which again, I think we've come up with workshops. I mean, all that fabulous work. I feel a bit torn because I am not an administrator. I don't like doing it. I am extremely efficient, but I'm not an administrator. And when I took it on, I thought at most it'll be a year or two that I have to do it before handing it over to, some other sucker who comes along and says, oh, what is this? Sure, I'll walk into it. And then I shut the door and say, fine, now you cannot escape. And no other sucker has come along. So I have remained the sucker for, what is it, 6 years, 5 years? Yeah. And so that has been exhausting. And, especially this semester, I guess, with everything else going on, it's felt like a lot of work. So just to put the word out there, I'm still looking for the next sucker to come, the next professor to join who will take over as director of CSGS.
I mean, this is again sort of going back to some of the things that you said earlier too. But you've taught both in the US context and in India,
Yeah.
and we were talking a lot about sort of specificities of writing, sort of, and doing the work that you've done in India. I'm just curious, what are the differences or similarities, or how was your work in the US? And how was it to study and teach in the US for you? How did that locational cultural setting impact, if at all, your intellectual professional journey? And what do you see sort of what's happening now versus how it was in the US when you were teaching there?
I mean, it's a difficult question because I certainly was not doing the kind of writing then as I'm doing now. But that's also not necessarily location, but also a stage of career or stage of where you are in life. So almost all the writing that I did in the US was academic. Not almost all. All my writing in the US was academic writing, because I was going through the tenure system. And I was, going through the sort of ranks from assistant to associate to full professor, and so I had to write. But when I say I had to, I must sort of qualify that, because I actually never write because I have to. I always write because I want to, and so I was very happy doing the kind of writing I
Right.
was. But as I said earlier, in the US, it's very clearly defined and very strictly defined. And if you're doing academic writing, then that's what you're doing. You're not doing any kind of crossover writing. So
Right.
I was, I did a couple of things for Indian newspapers when I was still there, but otherwise, all my writing was academic writing. So, all three of the books that I wrote, all three of the books I wrote, the book I edited, Shakespeare, which was just, so much fun. All of that I wrote as academic books published by academic publishing, university publishing houses. And so that was a very different genre of writing. I don't think my questions were different. I don't think
Right.
my analyses were different, but I certainly think my mode of writing was different. But I've always been, so the mode of writing I'm doing now is, I think, the mode that I'm happiest with, because it's a mode of that comes closest to my teaching as well. And we were talking about
Yeah.
this earlier. I'm very deeply invested in thinking about complex ideas. I don't suffer fools gladly. I don't like unrigorous thinking. I don't like lazy thinking. So I'm very, very deeply invested in complex ideas, but I'm not necessarily invested in their appearing insurmountable. I'm not interested in their sort of being so frightening and scary that people simply don't engage with them. So I'm interested in writing about complex ideas in ways that are not necessarily that complex. And so my last two books, Infinite Variety and Law of Desire, are what are known as crossover books. And by crossover books, what the publishing industry means is that it should be accessible to anybody. And I'm a really firm believer in that kind of writing, because I think anyone is capable of complex thinking if they train themselves to doing it. And that's what I'm interested in doing right now.
I mean, thank you so much for saying that, because I think that's what I've really loved and enjoyed about your sort of the latest book. But also, I think the Shakespeare in the world, in that sense, that was my first introduction to theory, actually,
Yeah.
while
Yeah.
we were not actually using any theoretical terms per se. So I'm just curious also to hear again, to go back to your YF course, a little bit about the final project. And do you think, you've been able to see over years that actual outcome in terms of what students were able to produce, in terms of engaging with the ideas, but not necessarily in an academic form?
Right. Right. And I think that too is sort of unique to the YF. And I am a big believer in this now, this idea of course, and as you know, since you're a writing preceptor at the YF, of course, Indian students in general need to learn how to write. Most of us went through college, and even those of us who studied English in college went through college without really writing an essay of any substantial length.
Right.
So Indian students in general do not know how to write. And so learning how to write is absolutely crucial on the one hand. And I completely stand by that. On the other hand, though, is writing an essay the only or the best way to provoke an engagement in a 6 week or out of a 6 week English class? And that was the big challenge that both Gil and I faced. And I think we were fairly clear early on that we did not want regular academic essays because this was not that kind of setting. And this was not the space in which we could teach students how to write. Our brief, and this is my brief in every class, is how to teach students how to think. And as you know, it is a sort of symbiotic relationship. Unless you're able to think clearly, you're not able to write clearly. And so we thought, let's just sort of focus on this, on one aspect of it. And I think the student projects, the reimaginings of Shakespeare are just brilliant. I mean, they are really brilliant. Obviously, there will always be, a few that could have gone further, a few that could have been pushed more, but that is true of any place, of any assignment. But as a framework, I just think it is amazing. It allows people to bring their strengths to the fore, whether that's, singing or dancing or acting or writing or, art or whatever it is. It allows them, again, to take a question or a text and think across multiple fields. And really, that's the only way to think. You cannot think narrowly, you have to think widely. And the projects are I think, amazing. The festival has just sort of got longer and longer and longer the more fellows that we have.
And you're planning to do it in person too, perhaps, if you go back to campus.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But it was just, it's wonderful. It's always a pleasure to sit through it. Although I must say, who was it? Was it Ishan who was complaining? Ishan was a TA for the course last year. And this year, or maybe it was Shivangi, I don't know, one of my TAs was complaining, saying how in person it's always harder for them because every 1 hour they have to run and get me samosas or brownie or something of the kind. And when we were on Zoom, of course, no one was there to bring me any khana whatsoever. Right. So I just sort of faded away and died. But from the TA's perspective, I think they preferred it on Zoom to being live.
But I think that's what most of us really do miss about campus right now, the samosas and the food that you get during the events, actually, which
exactly.
makes it fun.
Exactly.
I'm actually going to start taking some of the audience questions too, which we're actually addressing as we go. But this question specifically, because I'm also teaching.
Sorry, Shiv, just 1 second though, before you go there, I just want to say, when you said you're missing the samosas on campus, part of me really died because one of the things that's new in my life is that I can no longer eat samosas.
Oh, and right.
This is a big tragedy for me. So the tragedy that the world is going through is just an elaboration of the tragedy that I am going through. Because I can no longer eat gluten, and this is a big loss for me. So I can eat the aloo in the samosas, but I can't have the samosas. So unless someone comes up with a gluten-free deep fried samosa, all of you listening, this is your task should you choose to accept it. Gluten-free deep fried samosa, not baked. I mean, baked samosas are a horror.
I agree.
My life will be much happier then. Sorry, to go back to your, I'm sure, more interesting question.
No, I mean, actually, this is just another question filled with drama, which is about films, because, and I'm interested in it because I'm also actually teaching films right now. But I mean, just the person wants to ask, could you talk a bit more about the films, why you teach about them, how do they work in your thinking too, what kind of films do you like, and do you think film is an interesting form to think about queer theory?
Yeah. I mean, those are all great questions. I love film. I love teaching it. Again, I'm not trained as a film theorist, though. I'm not trained in film studies at all. So when I teach film, it's not necessarily from the film studies perspective. So, camera angles and all that, my knowledge is extremely rudimentary. I'm interested in film as yet another text for thinking about the questions I'm interested in. So I'm interested in films that think about sexuality, that think about sex, that think about gender, that think about, this kind of sort of politics. Having said that, yes, the form of cinema is also very, very interesting. What it does and does not allow you to do. In some ways, cinema is more controlling than a book because it sort of, with its editing sequences, it sort of tells you where to look. It shows you what it wants to show you. but that only makes it more challenging to actually be able to look and see things that they may not be, it may not explicitly be showing you, in which case it becomes much more like a book. For Shakespeare in the World, you remember, depending on whether I teach Othello or Romeo and Juliet, I teach, two of my favorite films, Omkara for Othello and Ram Leela for Romeo and Juliet. And actually, I've taught Ishakzadeh as well for Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
And I've also taught Arshinagar, which is, I think, an amazing film. But as you know, Shiv, we have a shared love of Bollywood, which I think too many people write off. I think Bollywood is a rich, rich repository
Yeah.
for anybody interested in thinking about sexuality, for anybody interested in thinking about political syncretism, for anyone interested in thinking about ideas that India has been animated by. And so, so I'm very interested in Bollywood, and so that's why the films I teach in Shakespeare in the World tend to be from Bollywood. But I'm, globally, I'm not a huge fan of Hollywood, especially not now. But globally, I'm very interested in. There are lots of interesting directors and producers. I'm very interested in Pedro Almodovar. I'm very interested in Michael Haneke films, in Hitchcock films. One of the films I saw recently, a French film called Q, which is translated as Cuties. I think it's on Netflix. Again, I'd recommend that to everybody. If you want to feel uncomfortable, go for it. It's a really fabulous film.
I mean, now we're moving into a different genre from next person's question, but this is a thing I actually didn't know. But somebody says that you've actually directed plays at Stephen's, and can you speak more about that and in general your relationship to theater? And
Shiv, how could you not have known that? I have those posters up in my office.
Oh, that's true. Now I remember actually, but we haven't spoken about it. So
we haven't spoken about it. See, some things are better not spoken about. That is why we haven't spoken about it. Well, I think being a director started out from my dirty secret of being a failed actor. So the Shakespeare Society at St. Stephen's College is the big deal. And I was part of Shakespeare for all my 5 years there, 3 years of BA and 2 years of MA. And I acted, I don't even remember how many plays. I guess I just repressed that memory, as part of Shakespeare for many plays. But I am not an actor. I am not a good actor. And, as anybody will testify, as any actor will testify, in order to be an actor, you have to be willing to make a fool of yourself. And I am usually not willing to make a fool of myself. So I'm not a good actor, which means, of course, then what you do is try and control actors and direct them. And so you turn to directing, which is something that I enjoyed a lot more, except that it's not always easy dealing with actors. So, it was fun while it lasted, but it's not necessarily something that I'd want to do again. But frankly, directing is quite amazing because it makes you, I mean, it's what you have all done in your reimaginings of Shakespeare. That's what it means to direct a play, is really to try and give it a flavor that you think is going to be important for that text to be steeped in. And that's just fascinating. It's what it means to be a good cook. I'm not a good cook either. But you think of flavors, you think of all these ideas coming together. And so directing is just a fascinating project, but it's long, it's from the distant past, and the most wonderful remnant of that are those framed posters in my office.
This is good to know now, the background story behind the posters. Yeah. I mean, there are a number of questions like this, so maybe it's just good to hear your thoughts about it. But I mean, there is one student who's asking that they're a commerce student who want to join YIF, but how would their journey look like if they were to sort of join the YIF? But also, what would you recommend, as books or as a reading strategy if they were to think about this direction? But in general, a lot of people do want to sort of hear about that transition.
You mean, so these are people who are not yet in the YIF, but who would like to join, right? I don't know, Shiv. I think you answered your own question a few minutes ago when you said just read everything you can get your hands on. You get your ideas always from somewhere. They don't fall out of the sky. No matter how brilliant you don't wake up one morning with ideas fully formed in your head, like Athena. Ideas come from somewhere, and they inevitably come from conversations. Now, those conversations can be between you and a book, those conversations can be between you and a film, those conversations can be between you and friends, but they have to come from conversations. They can be from, between you and magazines or journal articles or newspapers. And so when I say you have got to read widely, what I mean is you've got to be able to engage with ideas conversationally with as many texts and people as you can. That's the only way in which you're going to get a sense of what your interests are and where you would like to go. Because ultimately, no one can tell you where to go. You've got to figure that out. And I mean, one of the YIF words I don't like is actually the word journey, and especially because none of us is really traveling very much these days at all, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have this backdrop from Samarkand. But there is a way in which you have to be restless. You have to be moving all the time, intellectually, especially intellectually, given this time of physical stagnation, especially. And so, however you do it, just have conversations. And that's what's going to help you refine your thinking.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, a lot of people clearly in the audience are Shakespeare fans because a lot of questions are coming about your course in Shakespeare. So maybe just talking a little bit about that, but also specifically, one person has asked, where does Shakespeare and his writing stand today in the contemporary society? And maybe that could be one way for you to talk about how you try to do that within your course too at the YIF.
Yeah. I mean, this question actually, I mean, I've always had to think about it because, all my earlier books were on Shakespeare. But I think I had to think about it most fully when I was working on my edited volume, Shakespeare, which is subtitled A Queer Companion to the Complete Works of Shakespeare. And the reason I had to think about it then most fully is because precisely this, right? Because this question of, well, where is Shakespeare? Who is Shakespeare today? Where does he stand? Where do his works stand? Can be used almost dismissively. It's like, we really don't need Shakespeare right now. Why are we still thinking about Shakespeare? But the way in which I sort of entered that conversation was to say that Shakespeare has become so deeply ingrained in our ways of thinking that we don't even know that, for instance, a sizable chunk of our vocabulary, both conceptually and linguistically, is Shakespearean. And so for me, what was interesting while doing Shakespeare was just to try and become a little more self-aware of what is Shakespearean about our lives today. And I say this also as you remember, Shiv, in my first class, every time to Shakespeare in the World, I always tell the fellows, the only reason to study Shakespeare is in order to see the resonances with our time and age as well. And soon, shockingly, not so shockingly, we find that really most of the pressing questions of our time have already been thought about in some way, shape, or form by Shakespeare. And so, again, to go back to my earlier point about needing to have conversations, Shakespeare is a brilliant conversationalist. So, whether you want to talk about sexuality, whether you want to talk about gender, whether you want to talk about communalism, whether you want to talk about history, whether you want to talk about politics, whether you want to talk about drag, whether you want to talk about anything, Shakespeare has talked about it. And many of his ideas, many of the ideas from his poems and plays, are what have already come down to us. We just don't know that they're Shakespearean. So in many ways, Shakespeare continues to play for, reasons that aren't always great, but continues to play a really pivotal role in how we think about the world around us.
I mean, just taking off from there, but now I'm going to take probably a few fun questions. So this one really is asking you, which piece, I mean, which Shakespeare character would you like to be in if you could, and why? I mean, if you can think of it right now at the moment.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to think which Shakespeare characters I acted when I was in college. I played Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, which is a character I love since she is extremely snazzy woman who doesn't take any nonsense from anybody. And she's great. I love her. So I played her. Did I play her? No, No, I think I'm lying. I think I did not play Beatrice. I did not play Beatrice. My
Maybe
God.
you were wishing to do that, which is why now you strongly believe you did.
Yeah, it's obviously a fake memory. The role I played in Much Ado About Nothing, this is actually interesting. The role I played in Much Ado About Nothing in the Shakespeare production at college was Don John. So I played the male villain's character in that play, which is great, which I loved as
That's
well.
fun. Yeah.
But Beatrice is one of my favorite characters, and then of course one of my all-time favorite plays is also the one that I directed in college, is Twelfth Night, and one of my all-time favorite characters is Viola. And let me recommend again to all of you watching a sort of Bhojpuri reimagining of Twelfth Night called Pia Behrupia, which is, I think, one of the most brilliant conversations with Shakespeare that I have ever encountered. And the viola there is absolutely fantastic. So in Shakespeare, I like all his cross-dressing characters. I like all his sassy female characters. I tend not to like characters like King Lear or Hamlet
Right.
particularly. But maybe this goes back to my 10-year-old editorial, boys, something must be done.
I mean, the next question is again about the class, but I mean, this can be answered in two parts now because you did a Zoom version of your class this time. But
Yeah.
the person is asking, how do you manage to engage with such a large YF class on a topic that's alien to many of us actually in just the course of 6 weeks? So, how do you go about it? What do you think about your while thinking about your own pedagogy in class?
Yeah. I mean, I've never found it to be a problem because I think, I always bitch and moan about teaching the YF class because it always comes in the middle of an undergraduate semester. And when I have said yes to the YF team to do it, it's safely enough in the future. So it's like, it doesn't matter. I can think, oh, it's 8 months later, it'll be absolutely fine. And then when it comes and I'm in the middle of 100 other things, it's really, really stressful. I must say the fellows are what make it much easier because I find they are genuinely interested. They are genuinely curious. They genuinely like to talk. So the class is made a lot easier because of the people in it. And really, this is true of any class. A class is only as good as the students in it. And I think the fellows have always been terrific. But the way, the key, the secret really to any engagement, and this is not really a secret at all, is to be engaging. I mean, that's all there is to it. So you talk about things that are important, that are current, that are interesting, and you talk about them dialogically, and you automatically have a class that's engaged and fun.
So a lot of people are actually interested in knowing more about your PhD work, your graduate dissertation project. What was it about, and what was the process of working on it like?
Yeah. I mean, I told you I went to the US convinced that I wanted to work on Shakespeare, and I did. But I remember an early meeting with the professor who then became my advisor, Lee Edelman. And I told him, quite chirpily, that I want to work on Shakespeare. And he said, that's fine, but maybe you want to look at it somewhat differently. And just that sentence I found so intriguing. And I knew I wanted to work with Lee, and Lee is not a Shakespearean; he's a queer theorist. So I knew already that my take on Shakespeare was not going to be straight in any sense of that word. So it really sometimes just takes a little nudge, a little shove, a little push, a little sentence from here or there to just sort of tweak your mindset into a particular path. And so when Lee said, but I hope you will be able to think of Shakespeare in a different way, that's exactly what I did. And that's what I have been doing. And so my dissertation was titled Wanton Words, which is actually a quote from Twelfth Night, Rhetoric and Sexuality in English Renaissance Drama. And I was just sort of thinking, as a student of English, as a queer theorist, thinking about the relationship between language and sexuality. And that has been really my abiding concern till now. So again, it's sort of, it's the same set of questions. It's, as a friend of mine said, it's almost, you can say, it's like a monkey wrote this because you're writing the same thing over and over again, but you're just
Right.
writing it in relation to different texts. You're writing it in relation to different nuances. But I think once you get sort of notice of what your interests are, what your questions are, I find at least, and I know a lot of my colleagues and friends find as well, that you tend to stick to those questions and keep worrying at them, keep working away at them in different ways.
So there's this question, I guess, again about your interest in queer theory. But the
Yeah.
question is, do you think that a patriarchy entrenched society played a major role in shaping your work more towards a contradictory? I don't know what I mean, how you want to interpret that, but contradictory feel like queer theory. But I'm assuming that they're also thinking about why not feminist theory, why queer theory. Um,
Or maybe the question means sort of an oppositional field like queer theories.
right. Yeah.
I think that's what it might mean. I've no doubt, as I said, age 10, writing that editorial, boys. I think the word problem was in there somewhere. Boys are a problem. Something needs to be done, or something of the kind. So clearly, I was well aware of that. And again, as I said, it didn't. It was not a personal, or by personal, I just mean familial. It was not a familial experience because it was not the milieu in my household. It was not the milieu historically in my family because we come from sort of a matrilineal society, the Kerala Nayars. So it was not that immediate experience, but even among the matrilineal Kerala Nayars, there's a huge amount of misogyny. There's a huge amount of sexism and patriarchy. So yes, certainly the world around me, and that's what I mean by conversations. If you're not stuck in a bubble and you're actually aware of what's going on around you, it doesn't. I'm embarrassed that it took me till age 10 to write a piece like that. I should have been writing it from the womb itself because I should clearly have been able to see what's going on around me.
Right.
The only thing I would add is that I don't think it's only about having grown up in Delhi or in India. I think I'm afraid, patriarchally entrenched societies exist around the world.
Yeah. And I think I really like the way you put it, that having conversations just around the world around you. Because
Yeah.
I think that also I see that in my own journey because, just working at the CSGS was just about that. I really wanted to do something about what I saw were my immediate concerns about the society around me, the problems that I was invested in at the time. So I think that really sort of helps me think about it. I mean,
Right.
this again question is coming up in many different forms, and I think you've spoken a lot about it. But if you have additional tips, your advice for people who want to be writers, for an aspiring writer, what would you want to say to that?
Just read. That's the only way to write, is just read. And keep and make the delete button and the editing process your best friend, because without that, I mean, we've all had this experience of that wonderful sentence having come out, and then you read it again the next day and it's like, this makes no sense whatsoever, all
I
of us.
really hope my critical writing students are really listening to it right now.
But it doesn't matter how many years you've been writing for, that is going to happen over and over again, because that's the nature of the beast. Writing is a process that where you're sort of trying to translate thoughts from your head onto the page or onto the screen, and it's an extremely solitary process. So you're not getting feedback. You're actually being devoid of that kind of conversation, which is why editors, people who can read your writing, are your best friends, because you need that pair of alien eyes on something that is very close to your heart. So you've got to write, of course, which is a difficult process, but as difficult but as important as that is, you've got to let go of your writing. You've got to be able to say, I'm not that attached to the sentence. I am going to revise it. I am going to edit it. I am not going to feel that someone's criticism of my writing is a death blow. I'm going to see it as something that is going to make my writing much, much better. Daniel Boyarin, who is a professor at Berkeley and who is one of the contributors to Shakespeare, and when he sent me his essay, and it was terribly written, and I, made extensive edits and sent it back to him, and he was just wonderful. And he wrote back saying, "Thank you, Madhavi. I pride myself on being a terrible writer, but a fabulous reviser." And really, the best writing is the best revising. There is no writing outside revising.
Yeah, I mean, back to the fun questions. This again came up multiple times. So,
Yeah.
the person says, and this is first a compliment, so you have an amazing sense of style and have such a diverse set of saris. Is it coincidental or is it something that you've consciously curated for yourself? Just, your love of saris.
Oh, I love saris. Um, I wore saris throughout my time in the US as well, teaching.
Oh,
Every single class I ever taught in the US, I used to wear a sari. Even if I had to walk through snow, in my snow boots, I would wear saris. It helps, of course, that they have functional civic structures, so there's always a path cleared in the middle of the snow, so I wasn't literally tramping through snow. My big accomplishment as a professor, forget all this Shakespeare, queer theory, CSGS, Shakespeare and the world, forget all that. My big achievement as a teacher, as a professor, is that I never repeat a sari during a semester. So
wow.
this is, and I have always done that my entire career as a professor. I
Right.
never repeat a sari during the semester. And somehow, despite having a terrible memory, I'm able to keep track of what I have worn and
Yeah,
what.
I was just wondering whether you keep a list on what you've already worn.
No, but I can tell
Right.
quite easily. But I mean, I don't think I curate saris that much. I'm again sort of fairly clear about what I like. I like bold colors, and I tend to like sort of saris without patterns or designs, because I actually like patterned blouses and designs. So once you get those basics in place, and Shiv, that you're such a style maven yourself, and you dress so wonderfully. It's just whatever catches your fancy, and if you like it, you're going to wear it well.
That's
Like
true.
it, you're not going to wear it well. The same with books and
Yeah.
with writing, with everything. You've got to like what you're doing. You've got to like what you're wearing. You've got to like what you're eating.
And have
Hence,
a sense of style to go about doing it, right?
well, yes, but also style can be developed
Right.
as well.
I mean, so I've just got a signal that we're almost to the end of the conversation. So,
Okay.
last question to you, which is, can you just talk a little bit about what you see as the relevance of a program like YF, and where do you see this program going in the coming years?
Yeah. I mean, relevance of a program like YF, it is, I think, unparalleled. I think it is amazing. As I said, any program that can teach me to respect engineers is something that is doing an amazing job. And it's doing an amazing job precisely because it gives people a second chance. And, there are very few second chances in the world we live in. And it gives people an intellectual second chance, which again is very rare. And because of the MLS, which, as you know, is the second add on here to the YF, which you can add if you'd like, it really provides a turnstile to changing your entire academic trajectory, your entire academic course. And we've had so many hugely successful MLS students as well. So for me, the beauty of the YF lies precisely in its variety. People coming from so many different backgrounds, so many different places, so many different parts of the country, so many different languages. And that strength, frankly, is exactly what translates into the fabulous end products for Shakespeare and the world. Because you have such a melange, such a mix of people and languages and backgrounds and ideas, you get all these extremely rich reimaginings and projects. And I think YF should be the template for how education should be. Come to us, whoever you are, from wherever you are, and figure out what it means to think, figure out what it means to engage with the world around you. And alas, this sort of Indian education system, as you and I both know, provides too little oxygen for that kind of thinking, provides too little space for that kind of progress. And so, if you want to breathe despite Delhi's polluted air, come to the YF.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very convincing set of reasons that you've provided us. And with that, I'd again like to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation tonight.
Thank you,
Uh,
Shiv. You're a wonderful interlocutor as always. And as you know, I would not be, in many of the places at Ashoka if it weren't for you. So thank you for everything.
No, same here. And I hope really that if nothing else, people are really excited to attend Shakespeare in the World when they come to the YF.
Yes.
And that I think will definitely not disappoint you. With that, we'll take your leave. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining
Thanks.
us tonight. Bye.
Bye. Bye.